It's rare to find a government insider that not only recognizes America's system of two-tiered justice, but is actively working to expose it. Ramsey Clark served as Attorney General, overseeing the Department of Justice under President Lyndon B. Johnson from 1965 to 1967. During his term, Clark was instrumental in passing two of the most significant bills of our time, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Since leaving the administration, Ramsey has been one of the most prominent figures leading the charge against U.S. militarism. He's traveled everywhere from Vietnam to Iraq, where he studied the devastating effects of Western sanctions on local populations. He documented his findings in a 2002 book called Impact of Sanctions on Iraq, The Children Are Dying. Clark joined me earlier to discuss his research on Iraqi sanctions, the evolution of the rule of law since his time as Attorney General, and why he represented Saddam Hussein. I first asked him what Iraq was like before Western intervention in 1991.
Iraq was the most prosperous Arab country in the world. The standard of living was highest. Infrastructure was better than most parts of the United States. It had good education, good health care. That's before 1991, before the Gulf War, the invasion in 90. The period after 1991, January 1991, when we invaded and started bombing them, we had over 100,000 sorties on every few minutes to bomb the daylights out of the whole country in 1991. But before that, it was very prosperous and progressive, and since then it's suffered enormously. Nobody feels safe any day in Iraq, haven't since 2003 at least, if not 1991, and hundreds killed every week, thousands more often than not. The country's been crushed in a unique way for a uniquely long period of time, with violence enduring.
And in the 90s, talk about how many children died as a direct result of these sanctions, and why specifically children?
Well, I'm a big supporter of the UN. It's the hope of, one of the major hopes at least, of peace on earth. But the UN sanctions that were imposed on Iraq in August of '90 impacted severely on its imports, and they couldn't get infant formula, for instance. And by the late fall of that year, 47,500 children under the age of 5 had died as a direct result of the sanctions. Within 3 or 4 years, 475,000 could be counted who had died as a direct result of the sanctions. I was going into Iraq every year during that period, and I'd always go through maternity wards, and you were lucky if you spent 30 minutes in there to get out without an infant dying. They'd be on the bed with their mother. That's their custom there. And the mother would just start wailing when the baby died. We tried to take infant formula in, but it takes a lot of infant formula to feed the infants of a country the size of Iraq or larger, and they couldn't get it for all their wealth because of the sanctions and because of the military threat and the military action against them constantly. One of the great crimes against humanity since World War II.
Have sanctions ever worked without having devastating effects on the people of certain countries instead of the regime?
Well, if you think about it for a few minutes, sanctions impact the weakest, the poorest, those with less power, less access to the necessities of life and the pleasures of life. And infants, somebody's got to help them. They can't make it by themselves. And if their parents are poor and you can't import infant formula, and the mothers are malnourished, and mother's milk is well below normal production, if available at all in a particular mother, and the infants die. There's that famous incident which our Secretary of State was asked on one of our major interview programs, 575,000 children under the age of 5 dead as a direct result of the sanctions. Is the price worth it? And she notoriously looked at the camera and said, difficult question, but yes, the price is worth it. But listen, there's no morality and anyone who can say that anything is worth the lives of 575,000 children.
Ramsey, you were talking about the bombing campaign that was going on at the same time as these harsh economic sanctions were being applied to Iraq. What were the targets of those bombs at that time?
And they were hitting infrastructure primarily from one end to the other, from the border with Turkey to the Basra and below. And they were hitting bridges. In Baghdad, they hit so many places. I remember the Justice Ministry, which is a place I frequented, got badly hit. But it was intended to, it also hit agriculture, even trying to burn fields and destroy date crops and things like that, anything that would nourish the people. So it had genocidal purposes and was strategically determined.
Right, so not just military targets. I mean, obviously this is a lot of civilian infrastructure targeted on purpose, as you just mentioned. Given what you've seen and how sanctions adversely affect the population of these countries the most, how do you feel about this administration using humanitarianism as the justification for a strike on Syria?
Well, it's pretty inhumanitarian, to put it mildly. It's also a terrible violation of human rights and international law. One country can't take it upon itself to be a policeman for the whole world. Think it can bomb people wherever they are at any whim or for any stated or unstated purpose. Their purposes are usually unstated. They may state something that they claim is their purpose, but it rarely is their real purpose. Their real purpose is to change the government of Syria. They're driving and endangering the entire Christian population there, which is a very large population, for the largest of any of the Middle East countries. We need integration, religious and otherwise, if we're going to live in peace with each other. And particularly at this time, I've been very close to Muslim people. I love Muslim people, and I recognize their goodness and their strength and their courage. But we have to live at peace with them.
I couldn't agree more with that one, Ramsey. You've taken a lot of heat for choosing to be part of Saddam Hussein's legal representation. Why did you choose to represent a brutal dictator?
Well, I didn't seek it. I was sought, and I felt an absolute duty to do it if I was requested. Rights should belong to everyone. If we don't have equal rights, we don't have rights. We have privileges and underprivileges, you know. And I believe in rights. I've lived my adult life struggling for people's rights as a lawyer and otherwise. And he got no fair trial. A fair trial wasn't possible, perhaps under the circumstances, but certainly not turning him over to people who've been trying to assassinate him for the last 20 years. And finally did. After a trial, it was a farce. But asked to stand there with him and try to intercede in the interest of truth and justice, I would have had a hard time living with myself if I hadn't agreed to do it. I'd do it again in a minute. I could not do it.
Well put. Considering how this week marked the 12th anniversary of the horrific 9/11 terrorist attacks, what's your take on how the government decided to kill and throw bin Laden's body in the ocean instead of giving a trial, evidence, or any answers to the American people?
Well, to put it very mildly, we don't practice what we preach. And to put it more directly, we totally ignore fundamental human rights, international law, and our own moral standards when it comes to international affairs. Our government, I mean, you know, I just came back this year from the 60th anniversary of the war in Korea and the 40th anniversary of the war in Vietnam. Millions killed. The only good thing is the people are thriving. It's beautiful to see. It shows that there is a future after hell.
the war on terror is now carried out by the executive, being judge, jury, and executioner, especially in these drone wars, just killing people that they claim are terrorists without any fair trial at all. How dangerous of a precedent are we setting for the rest of the world with this policy?
Well, we're saying that the powerful do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. And that's the cruelest and most immoral thing that you can say to society. The powerful should try to uplift the poor, you know. They'd feel a lot better about themselves if they did. They'll talk about their aid, but it's so darn political, you realize it's just to strengthen themselves. And the violence that we were at, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, and it really hurt him to say it, the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. 1967 at the Riverside Church here in New York. The greatest purveyor of violence is the United States of America.
Someone like you who has served in the administration decades ago, seeing it out on the outside now, when you were serving in government, was it more transparent and accountable to itself and the people than it is today? Or is the level of deceit and corruption kind of all relative?
As Attorney General, I can tell you I felt a free hand. I wouldn't have stayed if I hadn't, to render justice as I saw fit. It's possible to make a difference, but it's a struggle, and it's not sure that any difference you make will long endure.
And what would you tell people now who just feel like it's hopeless and you know, looking at the world and say, how can we get out of this policy of bellicose militarism?
The harder it gets, the more important it is that we stand up and struggle. I watched in the 60s the pain and misery and danger to our African-American population. I spent a lot of time in the early 60s. I was working primarily in the early 60s. I was young, I was from the South, I had a Southern accent, I could pass. And the African-Americans were facing danger and humiliation and deprivation all the time. And they sang and they marched and they said, "We shall overcome." And we ain't got there yet, but we've gotten a lot better off than we were, and we're still struggling and still marching and still believing that we shall overcome. If you don't believe that, you might as well crawl in a hole and bury yourself. The struggle is the whole purpose of life.
It is indeed, Ramsey, and we definitely have seen change happen, albeit slowly. It does happen, and it takes the struggle in the streets. Thank you so much for being a voice of the people, representing justice and truth. Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General.